The United States President Joe Biden has indeed said that the world is facing the biggest nuclear threat since the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The off-camera comments were overheard by journalists from his White House pool after he'd finished speaking at the Democrat Party fundraiser in New York. It comes after Russian officials have warned of potentially using tactical nuclear weapons since they've faced setbacks in their invasion of Ukraine. A train belonging to a Russian military unit that handles nuclear weapons was also seen carrying a convoy of vehicles heading toward Ukraine from Russia just a few days ago. And the Russian doomsday submarine Belgorod has recently been spotted in the Arctic. Well, that's the backdrop to it, but is it all just so much nonsense, or is it really a frightening situation that takes us back to Fidel Castro, John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s. Joining me now on the programme, I'm delighted to say, is one who really does know, been there, done it, Rear Admiral Chris Parry, former NATO commander. Your view, Chris, serious threat or off-the-cuff remark from Joe Biden at a party political event?
There are two aspects to this, Alistair. One is the fact that there's distinct saber rattling by the Russians because they themselves are rattled by what's happened in Ukraine. And secondly, we've seen a pattern with American diplomacy whereby they try and out threats before they appear. And it's a method of deterring the other side from actually doing something. There are a number of issues going on that look as if they're routine, but they're being picked up, of course, as being sort of contingency and arising now simply because of the crisis in Ukraine. Right now, I don't see the crisis being as bad as that as in 1963. But we shouldn't underestimate the fact that there are certain circumstances under which I think Vladimir Putin would resort to nuclear weapons.
Fascinating, and I totally agree with you about the comparatives and ships sailing towards Cuba, photographed from the air. I remember those images so very, very clearly. And Jack Kennedy holding his ground very bravely, and in the end very effectively. The other thing I wanted to ask you to explain to our viewers and listeners, because it is an important point, when we talk about, World War III and nuclear weapons and the rest of it, there is this huge difference, isn't there, between strategic nuclear weapons like the intercontinental ballistic missiles and the stuff of Dr. Strangelove, and tactical nuclear weapons that are battlefield risks. Still ghastly and horrible, but there's a big difference there, isn't there?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Alistair. In terms of yield and damage, they're very different. But what we have to recognise is that there is a seamless chain between those strategic weapons and those that can be used at the tactical level. Once you open the nuclear Pandora's box, you really can't control what's going to come out next. So, for example, Putin, if he uses a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, he doesn't know whether he's going to get a ballistic missile back the other way to say, well, you've got our attention, and just in case you're thinking of escalating it further, one of your cities is just about to disappear. And that's the problem with nuclear deterrence. It's what I call not theory, it's theology. And a lot of these things are thought about in the abstract, not in the actual practical. But the fact of life is that Russia, along with 4 other countries for the past 2 decades, and I've been highlighting it quite a lot, say that nuclear weapons are war-fighting weapons. And we've cheerfully disregarded that fact. We see them as deterrent weapons to stop somebody doing something to us that's so awful, it's worse than actually having a nuclear exchange. But let's be explicit. Russia has said, quite openly, we use them as war-fighting weapons. And they have this expression. They say they're going to escalate to nuclear level in order to de-escalate, to bring an opponent to the negotiating table on Russia's terms. It's part of their doctrine, and it's entirely conformal with what I've been seeing with their actions at the moment. They're toying with it, and I'm afraid to say they think like mafia dons, so it's just another sort of tool in their box to try and coerce us and blackmail us. I think we're in the brinkmanship mode at the moment to see what the reaction would be. The two things I think that would probably tempt Vladimir Putin to use a tactical nuclear weapon are if he's faced with the loss of his regime, that's the first thing. And secondly, if he thought he was going to lose Crimea, which includes Sevastopol, of course, which the Russians are totally manic about keeping. And I think when you look at Ukrainian attacks on Kherson, which is the key to Crimea, we've got to be very careful indeed. And you'll notice with the recent attacks, what the Ukrainians did was show, if you like, their right hand by pretending to attack Kherson. It got the Russians' attention, and of course they attacked in the northeast at Kharkiv and took the Russians completely by surprise. So the Ukrainians are playing an interesting game here as well, with the Russians playing on their mind. And I have to say, actually judging the enemy by its own standards rather than by what we would do. But one thing is certain, Alistair, what we have to do is make it very plain to Vladimir Putin that any crossing of the nuclear threshold will result in basically, as far as he's concerned, unknown consequences, and nothing is off the table. And that's everything from a devastating conventional attack on something he values right through to a nuclear release. And let's face it, if he opens that box, everything's on the table.
And finally, very briefly, because I'm being told I have to move on, but you've just opened the box to another question I desperately wanted to ask you as a former top man at NATO. All of those possibilities, all of those options for NATO, the United States, the United Kingdom, all of us in that alliance are there in files and sealed boxes at NATO's Supreme Command headquarters. We know what we would do in any circumstance.
Alistair, the nuclear release is under national control. So what the United Kingdom would do, only Liz Truss and the current commanding officer of our ballistic missile submarine on patrol right now in the North Atlantic know that. Joe Biden and his commanders know that. So do the French. It's under national control, and NATO would have to ask there's a thing called extended deterrence.
Yes.
And it means that we're prepared to cover Denmark, Germany, and the others. That's part of the NATO commitment. But it's a national decision to resort to nuclear release. We must be very clear about that.